Seven, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. So hello and welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. Today we welcome author and historian Gareth Russell to discuss his brand new book, Queen James, The Life and Love of Britain's First King. Now, I got through this in record time, but I'm really excited to talk to you about it, Gareth. How you doing?
I'm very well, Jackson. Thanks so much. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
No, it's no worries at all. And I think the really nice thing as well is we're getting to discuss something that is, and I'm going to be in trouble with all my Tudor friends, that's not so heavily Tudor history, which I'm really excited about.
Yeah, it's got the familiarity of the Tudors because he steps on stage as soon as they left it. But yeah, I think I've written about the Tudors before, and I know it's a gold mine of interesting facts for people. But there was something really enjoyable about moving beyond them, and particularly with a life like James's that is, I actually think maybe more interesting than Henry VIII's, which might be heresy to say, but he is fascinating.
I wanted to ask, based on those lines, what inspired you to write on James and write this book?
Probably greed, actually. As a writer, you want to kind of feel greedy about the topic and hope that you can do it in a way that nobody else has or will. But I had done a book before, The Palace, about Hampton Court, and a sort of different decade, different room, different person as she moved through the history of the palace. But 3 of them were set in James's reign, and I do a lot of research that won't end up in the book because of what its focus was. But when I was writing the James chapters, I remember thinking that this was really compelling stuff, and there was a mountain of information that I couldn't include. So I couldn't really get James out of my head, and when I'd finished The Palace and we were talking about what to do next, I said, I think there's real legs here with James. So it started from encountering him in another work and finding him so fascinating that I couldn't quite let it go. And also wanting to look at Scotland and to look at what had come before those years at Hampton Court as well. So it was a combination of things, but mostly working on him in the palace.
I really like listening to how authors got to the topic, particularly coming through different research. But I really like the honesty there with you saying greed.
Yeah.
I don't think we often discuss that enough as writers.
Yeah, you have to be greedy because it's in the sense that you need to want to sort of consume this really passionately at the start because it's going to be a long slog. You're going to spend a lot of time with this person, and you don't have to be your subject's champion because sometimes they're not worth championing. But you do have to be someone who's really greedy to chronicle them and to write about them. And so, in that sense, James was a greedy topic. It's like a sort of fantastic, to extend the metaphor, all-you-can-eat buffet sort of historically interesting stuff, and some stuff that's well known and some stuff that isn't. So it's a gift. It's a real gift of a story to tell.
And I really like the point about chronicling there and that championing and not championing figures. But before we dive into looking at your chronicle of James, I think we kind of need to understand who James was. So who was he?
James was the famous son of a much more famous mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. He was born in Edinburgh in 1566, and his parents were a pretty disastrous example of marriage. His universally unlamented English father was found strangled in the grounds of a detonated mansion in 1567. Because of how horrible he was, there were many suspects, but popular suspicion fixed on his none too grieving widow, Queen Mary. There was a Presbyterian coup against her, and she has to flee abroad to England. And James, still in the cradle, is proclaimed the new King of Scots, James VI, by the Presbyterian coup. And in his later teenage years, he will take control of the Scottish government, and he rules Scotland up until 1603, solely as King of Scots. And then his English godmother, Queen Elizabeth I, dies, and because he's sort of the nearest in blood to her, he becomes King of England and Ireland, and the English monarchy also takes in Wales at the time and the Channel Islands. So he takes over really the entirety of the British Isles, and he rules as James VI in Scotland until his death in 1625, and the rest of the British Isles as James I. And in his time, he authorises the translation of the Bible into English that bears his name. presides, really despite him, a flourishing of the arts in England. He's limited interest. Unlike his remarkable Danish wife, Queen Anna, he survives many, many assassination plots, and he's also one of the few monarchs in history that sits down and writes political philosophy. In his case, a very sophisticated but firm defense of the divine right of kings and absolute monarchy. And unlike either of his parents, he dies in his bed, and on the throne. But the problem, I suppose, with that is that he is robbed in life of a great deal of tragedy that had befallen his parents, but he's also robbed in death of the romance of a downfall. And he I think, is written about later on in a very unflattering way as sort of this. He's remembered a bit. I think he's always remembered the way he was at the end, which is a figure who's often a caricature. I think quite an unpleasant and strange man.
And when you're talking there, I could certainly see that all-you-could-eat buffet idea you were talking about. And today I really want to see how we can get away from that caricature, because he's such an interesting figure.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, it reminded me in a really odd way of another Scottish royal I'd written about, which is the Queen Mother, the most recent Queen Mother. And age is a problem sometimes, not in life. It's a great gift to have in life. But it's a problem because there is a cultural expectation that comes with age, and often you are frozen in the public or the reading public's memory as you were at the end. And, it was hard to sort of, remind people that the Queen Mother hadn't always been 101. And also that James wasn't always this figure, and certainly there were many health problems towards the end, and he was someone who I think struggled with his health in the last 6 years or so. But actually youth, in a strange way, is the tonic, not because it's morally superior to age, but because it's the bit we remember the least. So part of the way I sort of, got away from the character of the Queen Mother was by reminding people of what it was like to be a teenager through the First World War, and when she was young in the Jazz Age in London. And it was the same approach with James, of really going right the way back and showing him as a teenager and as a young man in love for the first time in his 20s, and a very, very capable Scottish king in his 30s. So actually it was about really sort of rounding out the chronology of his life and showing that in the same way as his body aged and his reputation changed, his personality was different at different stages of his life as well.
And I really want to narrow down in that youth as well, because I think this period in Scotland, I think we also tend to forget that with James's story, is incredibly fascinating, with the Regency Council, with him taking charge. What is that Regency Council like, and how does it interact with James?
Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed that bit, Jackson, because I loved writing it. And there was a fantastically snarky review by a Scottish academic of another book about James that it said, this purports to be a book. I think it was an academic book, actually. But he said this purports to be a book about James VI and First. But as with most books, it just treats Scotland as a prologue until James gets a real job as King of England. And that was something I was quite keen to avoid, and again greedy in avoiding, because the Scottish stuff, as you say, is so rich. And a little over of half the book is in Scotland, because he spent a little bit of over half his life as solely King of Scots. When he's a child, obviously he can't rule for himself, and there is a long history in Scotland of child monarchs through a series of unhappy accidents befalling James's ancestors. So there's quite a good system in place within the nobility about who it goes to, and it's usually the closest male relative. So many people familiar with Scottish history will remember that Mary, Queen of Scots' regent, was her mother, her French mother, Marie of Guise, but that was unusual and actually came after the usual protocols. So it goes to James's uncle, the Earl of Murray, first. But Scotland is still reeling from the religious tensions and the political tensions that had caused the downfall of James's mother. And a lot of the early Regency Council are caught up in this. So there's sort of a domino of bad luck, that just a domino reaction flings through them. And Murray's shot, the next one shot, the third one dies of stress. Who wouldn't? Eventually, a tough-nosed, very sensible but equally unlikable aristocrat called the Earl of Morton takes over, and he holds it for most of James's childhood. And I think I was sort of expecting the whole thing to be chaos. I think that's the way it's written about. And actually, to their credit, once Morton gets a lid on things, really when James is about 7 years old, there is peace. I mean, it's referred to as a ticklish peace, which is a great way to describe it, but it is there. To their credit, and it's not often said, but they did shield him from the worst of it. He was kept in Stirling Castle, which was probably one of the most magnificent places I've ever visited, and incredibly well kept by Historic Environment Scotland. And going there, you get a sense that sometimes Stirling is written as if they put him into the backwater and it's up in a mountain and it's freezing. It's a magnificent palace that is on the crag in Stirling, but it's got, I think, the best views I've ever seen in my life. It's really, really sumptuous. So he was comfortable, and they did keep him behind the walls, or at least within the village, so that he didn't see anything politically unpleasant until he was a bit older.
And I think you're showing a powerful part of being a historian, is getting to visit the places you're writing about as well, and getting to get into the mindset of your characters, or people even.
Yeah, that's a great. If you can, it really does help, because sometimes you'll see something and you realize that it's so different to the image that you maybe had in your head. You do have to sometimes be aware that things will have changed. But Stirling, for instance, has a remarkable. I feel like I work for them because I keep telling everyone to see it, but it's a remarkable wing that was reopened by the late monarch Queen Elizabeth II, I think in 1995. But they spent a huge amount of time restoring the private apartments of James V and Marie of Guise to what they would have looked like when they were in residence, and you see how vibrantly colourful and luxurious they were, and it's fascinating. You are walking through a fully restored set of royal apartments, and the Great Hall is incredible. The chapel where James's son was christened in 1594 is there. It's really, really extraordinary stuff. So yeah, I did get a sense of what it was like, and really very kindly, the Stirling Tourist Board I'd been speaking with about doing some research there, they opened the church where he was crowned, and it's usually closed at that part of the season. So to see it empty was very, very special, because you sometimes, with the noise being gone, you feel history's a bit more present.
No, I totally agree with you on that. But then living there, what was James going through in terms of, we know he's a new Renaissance kind of king. He has to go through this education. What is he being taught? How is he being molded into Scotland's future king?
He's a bookworm, which helps. He loves learning languages in particular. He just adores, and theology is the other thing he really loves. And they marry together quite well, because a lot of theology will be translating religious texts. And so, by the age of 10, he wakes up, and before breakfast, he's doing exercises in reading and translating the New Testament in Greek. He loves this. He just thinks this is great fun, which helps, because it is a rigorous education. There's some subjects he's not good at, arithmetic, so he's not a maths prodigy, which made me like him more. And there's also there's physical education as well. He has two tutors, two local landowners, Adam Erskine and his cousin David Erskine, and they take him for horse riding and hunting, which will become one of probably the great one of the passions of his life. Football, which he really enjoys, and golf, which he loves, which I think, coming across the lists of things he owned, his little miniature golf clubs that he had was a fun discovery. But in terms of the curriculum within the academic classroom, there are two tutors, and they're sort of the good cop, bad cop archetypes. Peter Young is younger, gentle, and very liked, and in fact, James likes him so much that years later he will appoint Peter Young tutor to one of his own children when the time comes. George Buchanan is, to me, what he did was abuse. And actually, we have to be careful, obviously, with using words like that, because readers and viewers and listeners will rightly be cautious of the idea that we're projecting modern attitudes back. And it is worth pointing out that corporal punishment was considered to be to the benefit of the child. So I'm not talking about things like smacking or caning a child in the way that they would have been really right up until the 60s or 70s in this country. What Buchanan does to him is a level of sort of physical humiliation that it's enough that James's governess, the Countess of Mar, is constantly trying to undermine Buchanan because she is angry at the way he treats the king. So, when James is crying over the death of a pet, Buchanan slaps him. When James answers back in class, he repeatedly beats him on the rear. There's a lot and really constant negative comments in the classroom about what a harlot James's mother was, and that's repeated over and over again. And Buchanan's an interesting figure, I find him reprehensible, and I could fully understand why the Countess of Mar hated him. And what's painful to read is that when James is in his face, he still uses Buchanan as the touch point reference in his conversations for someone who was horrible. I mean, at one point he's writing kind of a breakup letter in many ways to Robert Carr. And he said, in our last argument, no one has spoken to me with such cruelty since George Buchanan. There's an incident in England where someone comes over to him and he looks so like George Buchanan that James starts physically shaking. So I don't doubt that there were things. I think it was a constant regime of humiliation and nastiness, verbal nastiness in the classroom towards him. And Buchanan, I think, has an ideological impact on James. So he's interesting because, sorry, as I said earlier, the letters that I found when he's educating James, he writes these letters and he expresses what his hope is. And it's in many ways, as you say, a Renaissance thing. He wants to create the perfect, all-rounded, virtuous Protestant king, the first raised Protestant monarch that Scotland will have, and to have him sort of be the torchbearer for the Reformation in the north of Europe. All fine, commendable stuff, probably a little much to put in a child, but that is what all Tudors would have been doing at the time. If you read Elizabeth I's Tudors, they wanted her to be a showpiece for the Reformation and for educational excellence as well. Same with Lady Jane Grey. But if you go a bit further into his political beliefs, he was a very odd choice to tutor a royal in that his political views come really, really close to republicanism. And if Buchanan was alive today, I don't doubt that he would be an anti-monarchist. I think the only reason he wasn't there in the 16th century, is because the language of anti-monarchism was still quite new and young. But he's very open about this idea that if the monarch isn't the right religion, if they don't reflect your values, that your loyalty doesn't have to carry through that. And in many ways, that's lawful resistance. We would recognize that doctrine today. But James, when he's in adulthood, he specifically bans books written by Buchanan if they touch on politics. And I think it's quite obvious from his own letters that his own passion for absolute monarchy is in part born because he finds the politics of his childhood tutor to be so offensive.
And it was really interesting reading about those dynamics, in James's early life. And I think there was as some people would recognise, a missing dynamic within that early life of his relationship with his mother. So how does James kind of fill that void in some kind of way, but then also have a relationship with his mother?
That's a great question, actually, because he does fill the void. And he fills it completely with his governess and the Countess of Mar, who I mentioned in my last answer. And he refers to her by the nickname Lady Minnie. And I was so glad that I decided that I would go and look at what that might mean. Because sometimes with, to use the current royal family as an example, Elizabeth II's nickname of Lilibet is just that's how she pronounced her name when she was younger. And her mother, I think that the Bowes-Lyons all called her Buffy because she couldn't pronounce Elizabeth when she was a child. She said Elizabeth. And I thought that's where it had come from. Because her surname was Murray, I thought had he made a mistake. But actually the word Minnie at the time was a nickname in Scotland for mother. It was their equivalent of mummy. So he called her Lady Mummy, and she slept in his room until he was 10. He was devoted to her throughout his life. He would hear sort of no bad word against Lady Minnie. And that was who he filled that void with. It was her. And it's not a perfect comparison, but in many ways, Mary was to him like a biological mother might be to someone who had been adopted as an infant and been brought up by somebody else, because he was brought up by somebody else. And he had no memory of his mother. He last saw her when he was 10 months old. And he then was subjected to this anti-Marian rhetoric in his classroom by George Buchanan, who loathed Mary, Queen of Scots, and created a series of inventively horrible lies about her that he seems to have passed on to her son. But what was interesting was that when James comes to 11, 12, he's absolutely thrilled anytime he hears an eyewitness account or something from someone who knew his mother and speaks positively of her. And that really shapes most of his teenage years. The problem for Mary is that at the back of his mind, there will always be this question of, was Buchanan telling the truth about her, or are her friends telling me the truth about her. And so anytime she messes up, and there are a couple of things that she fibs a bit with, I think understandable that James was upset about them, understandable she told the lies given the condition that she was in when she was under house arrest in England. But when she does anything like that, the shutters kind of come down with James, and it's almost as if, oh, you are a liar. Oh, you are what I was told. So that, I think he always is hoping for to feel more for his mother than he does. But somewhere within him, there's always this question of how much Buchanan told the truth.
And you certainly get the impression reading the book that James was a very complex person, a very complex character, having a multitude of different views on politics, religion, and people. But then coming to the throne, he's taken over after the Regency Council. What kind of king is he? How does Scotland react to that moment?
He's initially very popular, and actually, I mean, there's a dip in about 1590s when he's in his mid-20s. There's a bit of a dip, and he's quite unpopular for about 3 or 4 years, and then it rises back up again, and he's well thought of. Generally, like any member of the royal family even today, or political figures, there will be periods where people are irritated or believe something questionable about them. But generally, he was, I don't think I'd realized until I started doing a lot of the research and also having the opportunity to really luxuriate in reading a lot of the academic work about late 16th century Scotland and what is happening in the world around him. And I was surprised at how effective he was. I think that's been written out of popular understandings of him. You know, he was a very successful king of Scotland. He bends this cycle of coups that's been going on. He does end up controlling the aristocracy. He takes longer to stabilize the economy. That's one thing he struggles with. He comes to the throne when there's inflation happening and he has to rein that back in, and it takes much longer than he would have liked to do so. He negotiates a series of very successful treaties, and even things that the one he sort of can't win and probably didn't deserve to win was during the North Berwick witch trials in the early phase. He can't win because on the one hand, there are, incredible as it may seem to us, many people in Scotland who think he's feeble and he's not doing enough, and that demonstrably the devil is active in Scotland, and that the king should be leading a moral crusade to wipe it out at any and all costs necessary. And it's not just the North Berwick witch trials, there's a later one focusing on a pretty tragic individual nicknamed the Great Witch of Balwearie, where James just will not get involved because he's not convinced it's real. And as you say, that's more complex than the ideas we maybe have had of him before. So on the one hand, he has people who think he's insufficiently zealous in the crusade against satanic activity. And on the other hand, you have people, many of them quite close to him, who think he's lost his mind during the North Berwick witch trials. And that includes, I think, by this stage, a former lover, certainly a long-term friend, and his wife, who are trying to get him to rein it back in. And by that point, he won't, with the North Berwick witch trials. So he is complex and very thoughtful, at times very successful, and at other times reprehensible. And that makes him, by contemporary standards, a very good king, and by our standards, I think, a much more interesting, difficult figure.
And I certainly found that reign in Scotland so fascinating. But then we touched on the political body of the king. I think we're often guilty of this within history, of just looking at kings and queens as political figures, but they are people who have personal lives. And you say that James was a discreet lover. What does this mean, and how did it come about in his personal life?
Well, when he starts to obviously become attracted to men, there's sort of a few comments made in his early teenage years about that he seems to have these crushes. They're not really sure what they're commenting on here. But really, the first clear evidence is about 17 or 18, and with an East Scottish nobleman called Patrick Gray, and then each time it becomes more obvious. And I think in Scotland, there doesn't seem to be any pushback against it, except when the third romance, and probably the most serious in Scotland, becomes identified with James's delay in getting married, and that these relationships are causing First of all, foreign policy complications because an alliance will come with the marriage, and so will hopefully a trading agreement. And secondly, there is no really clear heir to the throne. It would be James's second cousin Ludovic, the Duke of Lennox, and that's not a watertight claim. There would be other claimants. So the pressure on him to do his duty, get a son, or even a daughter, so that there will be no civil war if he dies, it becomes quite intense. And at that point, there starts to be pamphlets in Scotland making fun of him about his private life, referring to him as a buggerer. And he himself writes this remarkable document where he talks about, I was found fault with by all men for not wanting to get married, and he goes into the countryside to pray for guidance on what to do. So his discretion about his sexuality is fascinating, partly because you're right, you can't separate it from the political body of the king. And you can't separate these 6 men that James was in love with from his record as king any more than you can the 6 wives from Henry VIII. They have a massive impact. And the discretion is sort of a dichotomy of discretion, because James has a very clear view on court versus public. It's almost a kind of snobbish view. It's that, and he is panicky, paranoid, and sometimes aggressive if there are suggestions that he is having sex with men in the public rumour mill. He hates it and does it, and visibly gets angry. Yet within the court, he makes no effort to hide it. I mean, there's, seeing the Duke of Buckingham across the room and shouting, "By God, George, I love thee," and inviting the Marquis of Huntly to spend the night in his bed and sending all the servants away. But it's a very strange thing. So, I mean, I talk about the public's reaction to it in the book and how interesting that is, but I also had to make sure that it was kept clear that that's public speculation and these are the private eyewitness accounts that we have, because it's very different, because he behaved differently.
I think the most interesting reaction I find is Anna of Denmark, his wife. How does she respond to these relationships and these lovers that James has, and when does she kind of find out?
Yeah, I loved Anna. I mean, really, she was the unexpected joy of the book. She's just fantastic. I mean, like him, I'm not really interested in sort of black and white characters. She is all kinds of grey, or in her case, many shades of a diamond, because she was just constantly expanding her jewelry collection, and good for her. But she she could be greedy, and she was greedy and extravagant and petty, and she was also brilliant and loyal and kind and vindictive and clever and all of these things. And she hits the ground running. I mean, she's 15, 16 when she becomes Queen of Scots, and by the end of the year, she's this formidable force in politics who is making sure that she gets exactly the amount of land she deserves. And she does this brilliant trick that I just thought was genius, where she pretended to her staff that she was struggling with her Scots and couldn't speak it and couldn't follow it, so that she could hear what they were saying about her when when they thought she couldn't understand. But whilst you can see this really clear, formidable political force developing by the time she's 17, the question of when she knew about him and other men is a lot more complicated, because we can be absolutely certain that she knew by the early 1610s, but that does leave a 20-year gap of what did she know and when. Some things I found out during my research indicate very strongly that she knew by the spring of 1603, when he becomes the King of England. I think it was probably slightly earlier. My guess would be the summer, and I go into the book why, the summer of 1600, when there is a scandal between James and a male favourite that sort of forces her to see it. But I also think that, not in her defense, but in context, he really does try when they get married. I think there is no real record of male favourites in the aftermath of the wedding and for a few years after. And I think if she had suspicions, and there's a couple of people who could have tipped her off or sort of given her the nod at the Scottish court, she certainly does not change her behaviour until 1600. And Anna's a ruthless, glittering pragmatist, and from her perspective, actually, male lovers are better than mistresses. One, they can't outshine her. There will be a limit on how far they can go. She won't have to suffer the indignity of a mistress at court, and most importantly, she will not have to suffer, as her mother had to suffer, the sight of her husband's illegitimate children flourishing at court. So Anna does accept it. And actually, at one point, she's trying to get rid of one boyfriend by picking another to rival him, which I thought was fantastic. But she also really does develop with James a real friendship, and some of their letters to each other that I quote in the book, where they're making fun of aristocrats who annoy both of them, are fantastic. So there's a loyalty, and I refer to her as his best ally, and I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah, and I think her involvement in helping pick those new favourites was a great political moment
Loved it. And it was so shameless. It was just ruthless. And she got the job done. You know, she did get the other favorite destroyed. And I think there's always kind of different theories about, you know, was these cultural reasons she didn't like him. She's very clear. He laughed at her once and was rude, and she was like, well, now I'm going to have to destroy your life. And she did. So I hope that joke was worth it, Robert, because she laughed last.
Yeah, I mean, a fair play. You know,
Yeah, listen, she was very clear on what the conditions of the deal were, and you decided to break them.
But then, you know, there's another main woman in James's life who you really can't talk about James and his development as a king without mentioning Elizabeth I. You know, what was their relationship like? But then how was James and Elizabeth's advisors kind of working to ensure a smooth transition?
Yeah. Well, it was funny. When I was working on the book, I was talking about with Tracy Borman, who's working on a book about the transition between the two dynasties, but she's working on it from the English perspective. So it was funny. She sort of thought that, you know, we were both reading the correspondence between James and Elizabeth. And Tracy was like, poor Elizabeth, like James is just thinly veiled, constant requests of when you're going to die so I can become King of England. And I thought, from James's perspective, I was like, Elizabeth's a nightmare. So it's interesting. You can. It was a very different perspective in Elizabeth writing it from James's point of view. And I actually probably ended up admiring her even more than I had at the start, because she played him brilliantly. But one thing that I think is not to Elizabeth's credit, and one of the reasons I think, that we have this vision of her very successful reign from an absolutely brilliant and remarkable monarch. But one of the reasons why we have this vision of her as a golden age is that it ended so peacefully, and that is down to James and her advisors. It's not down to Elizabeth. And I hadn't realised how much of a Russian roulette she was playing with the future after she died, until you see this correspondence that has to build up between James VI and her advisors, chiefly her chief minister, Robert Cecil, to try and ensure there'll be a peaceful transition of the crown when she dies, because Elizabeth will not name an heir to the throne in case they become a rival or a replacement. So really from the latter part of the 1590s, James is writing secretly to London in codes, and fortunately many of the correspondents burn their letters, but there's enough that survive that give us an idea of what they were planning. And it all goes off very, very smoothly. But it is a testament to him and to Robert Cecil, as much as particularly Cecil has a very negative press, and not always undeservedly. It is a testament to their firm pragmatism that the country has this peaceful change of dynasty in 1603.
And do the English people outside of the political body expect him? Do they like him as he's coming down from Scotland? Because England's traditionally had quite a rocky relationship with the Scottish.
Yeah. And that does become an issue later. I mean, really intense anti-Scottish sentiment is rampant in the latter half of his reign. It's not at the start. I mean, he's adored there, and he actually he says himself, overwhelmed. The crowds that are pushing to see him, and they're actually injuring themselves to get closer to him. And there's a roaring trade among farmers on the route to hire out their carts so that people can climb up and see the king as he goes past. And at one point, they're screaming, "Show us your face, your majesty." And at one point he turns to a Scottish gentleman and says, "Well, pull down my breeches and show my arse." I mean, he's getting quite flustered. He's adored. And part of that, to go back to your previous question, Jackson, is some of the letters I read from judges in the localities in the counties say, we were all convinced that when the Queen died, because there was no clear successor, that our houses were going to be burned and there'd be war with Scotland and civil war in England. And even in the few days just after Elizabeth dies, food prices in the cities in England rise by 400%, and that because people are starting to hoard. And then when James's allies like Cecil have this peaceful transition, everyone is so relieved and so euphoric that there are just scenes of joy. When he arrives in London, people say the city was paved with people, spectators. Obviously, you can make a very fair point. How much is that about him versus the fact that no one's wading ankle deep in blood from a civil war and just sheer relief? And that's an impossible question to answer. There's a great, which still might be true, from a foreign diplomat, where he says the English love their royals, but they want to see them. And James doesn't like being seen. He, as I said, he struggles with public attention, and that is what leads to the nosedive in popularity.
I completely understand why the English wouldn't have wanted to go into civil wars. I mean, it's only 120 odd years since the last one. It wasn't a particularly nice one either. So I can understand that kind of desire. But then, James has suddenly entered this world which is far richer. Um, there's a far different kind of approach from the aristocracy in England than there is in Scotland. How does he kind of adapt his kingship to meet the needs?
Badly, really badly. This incredibly sharp, brilliant King of Scots becomes a much more checkered King of England. And part of that is situational. I mean, he knows his home country. He knows the men and women of Scotland because he grew up with them. He knows every nuance to the nobility. Lowland, Highland, the ones in the Isles. He knows exactly how to deal with all of them. And he doesn't know how to do that, whereas Elizabeth had, because again, she'd grown up with them. She knew all these families. He is under the impression that he has entered a world of limitless obedience and limitless money. And whilst the aristocracy will never rebel against him, and they are much more obedient and respectful than the Scottish nobility had been to him, they caused a lot of trouble. Their manners do not always mask their intentions, but the biggest problem for him is that he is taken in by the glitz of the English monarchy and these palaces that dazzle, like Whitehall, which is the largest in Europe, and Hampton Court, that's considered one of the finest. The English monarchy is very wealthy. It has a good amount of land within England itself, a lot of which has the wool trade. On its best days, the English monarchy has an income about 19 times higher than Scotland's, partly because it just has so much more land and it has more people on them. It is in serious debt, and it has been for a long time. The damage had been done before James was born. It was Henry VIII that pushed it into financial nosedive, and his poor children had spent so much trying to, cut these golden chains that Henry had shackled them with. And they never quite get there. And by the time James becomes king, the exchequer, particularly in relation to the royal household, is hundreds of thousands of pounds in debt. Now, they can put on a really good and glitzy show, and James is taken in by that. But it takes a while. It takes about a year before he realizes that we're snookered. But he can't, by this point, there's almost like a financial bulimia has taken over. The money comes in, and then he spends it in these rash, extremely unwise, extravagant ways. And I will give him a bit of a defense here, which is that people are constantly, his critics in Parliament are horrified and are saying, well, you spend so much more than the late Queen did. And he was like, well, yeah, because there was only her. And there's me, there's my wife, and there's my children. You have a royal family again. You don't just have the monarch. And you haven't had a royal family really, to all intents and purposes, since at some point around the 1540s. So, and even if you want to be really pedantic, you haven't had a properly functioning royal family where everyone's at court at the same time since Henry VII. So, a century ago. So he is completely correct in that point, that there are things that have been done before he gets there that makes the finances really tricky, but there's also a lot of stuff that he does that makes it worse. And he was a bad maths student when he was a child, and he's an even worse one as King of England.
I mean, as a historian, I completely empathise with.
Could not understand harder. I really, Jackson, 100%. I was like, James, I understand where this mistake has been made, but I'm going to have to write it up anyway.
Yeah, I would have lent very heavily on Robert Cecil for a
I
lot
would
of that.
never have let Robert Cecil out of my sight unless I knew he was doing work for me. Ever. I would have been completely reliant on him.
And I completely understand why he was, because Cecil just seems absolutely amazing. But then there's a number of male favourites that begin to try and get some political standing. Who were they, and how successful were they at being political players?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you make that link with Cecil, because I think that is a big part of it. And his death in May 1612 is the turning point. So James has these love affairs before, and some of them are longer lasting than others. And there's four. There's been four proper ones really by this point. But when James is King of Scots, he has no interest nor need for the favorite, for the lover to move from the bedroom to the council chamber. They are men he loves in his private life. They're not people he needs for his government, because he knows how to rule Scotland. And for the first 9 years of being King of England, it's Cecil he can trust for everything. And James is very good at recognizing and rewarding intelligence, which, whatever else you think of Robert Cecil, he certainly has. And the favourites that James has at this point, Philip Herbert, who's a member of the Welsh aristocracy, and then Robert Carr, who's Scottish, they are kept out of politics. And Philip Herbert, to his credit, has no interest in getting involved in politics. I have a soft spot for Philip when he's younger, because I always think, know thyself, and Philip is a dashing moron, and he is very open about it, that he's sort of thick as clay. And even when James asks him to do some secretarial work, Philip's like, I can't. Writing's not a strong suit. I can play cards and dance and hunt and drink, and all, I'm sure, many other things, but not anything that will make you a member of government. And Robert Carr starts to develop political ambitions, and Robert Cecil keeps him at bay. And it's when Robert Cecil goes and dies, 1612, that you see Robert Carr move into a much more politically prominent position. And I think two factors combine. One is that James's health is starting to go. And secondly, he feels that he never quite has the grasp in England that he had on Scotland in terms of knowledge of how it works. And now that Cecil's gone, he wants someone, and he needs someone to talk these things through with. And Robert Carr has become Earl of Somerset. He and James have been really together for about 3 years before this, 5 years, and there hasn't been a massive amount of tension or political importance paid to it. Everyone at court tries to mimic how Robert dresses, and that's sort of the limit of it. But now that he's becoming more influential and Cecil's out of the way, aristocratic families latch onto him, and he becomes the prize in the middle of a fight between the more Catholic conservative faction represented by the Howards and the Puritans represented by the Herberts and the Risleys. And as a result of this, for the first time, the issue of James's sexuality becomes politically charged. There's really quite beautiful letters that James sends Robert when he feels that politics are beginning to crack open the relationship, and ultimately they will destroy it. And that is the relationship Anna steps in to euthanize and replace with George Villiers, the future Duke of Buckingham. And George, in the same way that Cecil's death paved the way for Robert Carr to go from private to political, Anna's death opens the gate, for George Villiers to go from private to political. And it's after her death in 19 that James is increasingly unwell, completely shorn of any of his previous confidants, and George Villiers does rise to become pretty much the second most powerful person in the kingdom. And partly because of the amount of correspondence between them about things like that, we have a really rich paper trail of the moments where the politics and the personal completely synthesize. And there are quite saucy letters between George and James. There are political ones, there are ones that are both, and there's some remarkable ones. They're referring to each other as husband and wife. George asks him, does he remember the first night they shared a bed, that magical night I will never forget? They reference a ceremony they'd gone through that they refer to as a marriage, which was stunning to encounter and discover. And also, think when James is aware of how politically unpopular it's becoming, he sends a note to George where he says, I would rather be banished into poverty in any part of the world with you than live a widow's life without you here. So he is aware that it's becoming politically a liability for him, but he loves him so much that he will not send him away.
And I think that those letters are absolutely extraordinary. And I think that was something that really struck me towards the end of the book was Charles's reaction to George Villiers, particularly at the end of James's life. What was Charles's kind of reaction to George? Did he enjoy his company? Did he respect him?
He initially hated him. And George very cleverly, with an eye to the future, knew James is not going to live forever. The present is James, the future is Charles, and he sets out to charm him. And who George sets out to charm, he almost invariably succeeds in doing so, and they become very, very close friends. Now, whether Charles knew that there was this sexual romantic component between his father and his best friend, we don't know. There is a letter really towards the end that comes quite close, I think, to implying that he knew something was going on. He says, if you're not there, he can't be happy unless you're with him. There's kind of the implication that Charles is very aware his father's complete sense of happiness rests on whether George Villiers is there. But it's equally possible that George hid it from him or said it was all lies. I think what's crucial with some people have said, how on earth could Charles not have known? And I suppose the credible answer is that by the time this really takes off, Charles is an adult. He's been given well, by their standards, he's an adult. He's sort of 17, 18. And he's been given his own household as Prince of Wales. So he's not at court as often as his mother had been or his late brother had been. So I think it's possible he didn't know. Maybe, like many people, he had a huge capacity for denial. Certainly that's not something Charles I is not famous for having. So, but that phrase, as you mentioned, that letter towards the end, does seem to indicate that he was very aware of the emotional component. But he was devoted to George too, and I always say the most interesting thing in terms of public opinion actually getting it right, very oddly, is that while there are constant insinuations in the rumour mill in London that George and James are having an affair because of how close they are, there are never those kind of rumours about him and Charles I. These do not surface, which would indicate that there was a very visibly different dynamic in his relationship with father and son.
And I think that's a really nice point to make, is that the visuals of relationships are, and particularly Renaissance and medieval understanding of visual representation is far stronger than they are today. So there would have been some awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people are completely correct to feel slightly skeptical about us constantly trying to, force the historically dead out of the closet. And with a book like this, I wanted to be really clear in the letters and saying, actually, this isn't typical. And sometimes it's so obvious in any period of history that this would be two people in love with each other or sleeping together. But yes, what's interesting is that there are some accounts I read, diary entries actually, from people visiting the court that maybe lived in more conservative or just simply an environment where, as many people at the time, wouldn't have encountered homosexuality or wouldn't have known that that's what they were seeing. That they can't understand why the king is kissing the Duke of Buckingham's neck, or why he's throwing himself into his arms and saying, I want only you in my arms. James is someone who feels quite strongly, and there are times where he forgets that there's a room full of people. But there's also letters that clearly state that he can't hide these feelings in other incidents. So there's once George is on a diplomatic mission abroad, and James writes to him, "Sweetheart, this day I had to ride on from everybody else because the tears were streaming down my cheeks. I want nothing but to feel you in my arms again." So it's very important to note that people did express themselves in a different way, and equally important to say that there is no Platonic explanation for that whatsoever. And that's part of again, to go back to the greed, I mean, part of the real joy of this book is that there are such a magnificent amount of sources, so that you're not just telling the history yourself, you're also letting the reader hear some of his words and the words of his wife and these men.
I think that's a really nice way of discussing it, is that there's sources there that point us to some things, particularly with those relationships. There are things that don't happen to be said in any Platonic relationship, and when we begin to think like that, it contextualizes things a little bit better. But I think that's a really nice point now to go to our final fun question, Gareth. Because, you're also a fellow podcaster with your Single Malt History podcast. But what is your favourite story that you've had on the podcast?
Oh, it's a great question. I think probably my favourite my favourite story was talking with Penelope Wilton, who a lot of people will know from Downton Abbey, but it was just before she played the Queen Mother in the West End, and I'd helped a little bit with the research, but she came on and she was talking about the experience of what it's like to research playing someone that famous And it was just it was interesting because it was different. It was outside my area. It wasn't a historian, it was an actor talking about what that was like. So I loved hearing that. And also just, I mean, she's fantastic. So that I loved that. And I loved hearing about the whole research process for that.
I think that's a really, really nice way for us to kind of change the way we look at history. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that. And then obviously people are going to want to go and learn more about James's life. Where can people find a copy of Queen James?
Well, if they are in the UK and Ireland, and I think Australia and New Zealand, they're at all good bookshops or online. And the Audible version is out the same day, 27th of February. And if you're watching from the United States or Canada, a little bit longer of a wait. It is out for pre-order, but it's called The Six Loves of James I as a sort of direct riposte to The Six Wives of Henry VIII, I think. Six Loves of James I. It's out on December 2nd, and as I say, hardback and audio are both available for pre-order.
Oh, fantastic. We'll make sure a link for that is in the description below. And then if people want to catch up with you and Single Malt History, where can they go?
Yeah, Single Malt History is available wherever you get your podcasts, and _ Gareth Russell on Instagram is probably where I'm most active at the minute.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming on.
No, thank you, Jackson. I loved this. Really enjoyed it.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way.